all that celebrations are magnificent, at the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service.
The words were barely spoken before the room seemed to change. Prince William had entered expecting an emergency family discussion, but he left behind something far more explosive: a declaration naming Prince George the sole successor to the crown. No shared understanding, no room for competing interpretations. One heir, one future, one unmistakable choice. And for everyone gathered behind those closed doors, the question was suddenly terrifying. Why had William decided this had to happen now? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William entered the Windsor meeting carrying only a prepared statement, and Catherine immediately sensed that something had hardened inside him. King Charles III watched his son take his place, while senior advisors remained unusually quiet. An emergency crown meeting, in plain terms, is a private gathering called when the royal family believes an urgent decision affecting the monarchy cannot wait. William was not there to debate possibilities. He was there to make one unmistakable declaration. William formally named George the sole successor, making clear that he wanted the future line of royal authority understood without competing interpretations. The phrase carried enormous emotional weight, because succession, the order determining who eventually inherits the crown, had always been treated as something guided by established rules rather than dramatic personal statements. Catherine heard every word, but her attention kept returning to what those words would do to their son. Pride flickered across her face, then fear replaced it. Charles did not interrupt. The king simply remained still after William finished, and that silence unsettled the prince more than anger might have done. He knew his father understood the consequences immediately. George was not simply being acknowledged as the next generation. The boy was being placed at the center of a declaration designed to shut down uncertainty before it could grow. William set his pen beside the statement when George was brought in for the closing minutes. The young prince looked from his father to Catherine, then toward his grandfather. No one smiled. George finally asked, "Does this mean everything changes?" Catherine stiffened, and William hesitated before answering. In that pause, the personal cost of the declaration suddenly became impossible to hide. A senior advisor quietly reread the wording and noticed how deliberate it was. William had gone beyond reaffirming George's expected place. He had removed every trace of ambiguity about who he believed must carry the crown forward. Yet Catherine knew this decision had not begun that morning. She had watched her husband change weeks earlier, after one disturbing moment, involving George, convinced him that waiting was no longer safe. To understand why William was willing to shock even his father, the people standing around George, and what each of them feared losing, must come into focus first. For the public, George had always represented continuity, a young prince, growing slowly toward a distant responsibility. For William, the reality was far more personal. This was his son, not a symbol. Catherine understood that difference better than anyone. Charles understood it too. And yet, after the declaration, each of them looked at George through a different lens. One saw a child to protect, another saw an heir to prepare, and William suddenly seemed determined to do both at once. Catherine stayed close to George after the meeting ended, watching how quickly the atmosphere around him had changed. As the eldest child of William and Catherine, he already stood nearest to the future throne after his father. But that position had always existed at a safe distance from his daily life. Succession, the order that decides who inherits the crown, was no longer just an old rule sitting quietly in the background. William had dragged it into the center of the family, and everyone could feel the pressure it created. George finally sat beside his mother and looked at her with a question that cut through all the formal language. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, explaining that everyone had looked so serious when he entered. Catherine took his hand immediately, and told him none of this was punishment. She assured him he had done nothing wrong. But the question stayed with her, because it proved the declaration had already reached him emotionally before he could fully understand what it meant. William heard about that conversation soon afterward, and the guilt hit him harder than he expected. Catherine told him quietly that George needed certainty, but he did not need fear. The prince did not argue with her concern. He simply answered that uncertainty had become the greater danger. To him, the problem was no longer whether George would one day inherit responsibility. The problem was who might try to shape that responsibility before the boy was old enough to defend his own judgment. Charles understood the cost better than most. As the reigning monarch, he carried the institution itself. But as George's grandfather, he also knew what it meant for a young life to be mapped out long before adulthood. William approached him privately and said he no longer believed royal succession could remain an unspoken assumption. He wanted his son protected from future family pressure, changing loyalties, and what he called competing influence. Charles reacted immediately to those two words. The king asked what exactly his son meant. William glanced toward the advisors nearby and refused to explain in front of them. That hesitation told the monarch everything he needed to know. This was not theoretical planning. Something had already happened. Catherine knew exactly what it was. Weeks earlier, during a family ceremony that should have passed without tension, George had been pulled into a conversation that left William furious. The declaration may have shocked Windsor, but the real beginning came earlier, when one carefully chosen sentence made the future king believe that silence was no longer safe. Every royal crisis eventually acquires a moment everyone looks back upon and says, "That was when it truly began." For William, it came not during an argument or a constitutional meeting, but during a formal family ceremony where nothing was supposed to go wrong. George had been prepared, reassured, and carefully positioned. Then a private conversation reached William's ears, one involving his son's future, his authority, and a suggestion he believed should never have been made. William had already grown uneasy about how often people around the family were discussing George as though his future belonged to everyone. He wanted responsibility introduced slowly, without turning his son into an adult heir before childhood had finished. Catherine supported that line firmly. A formal family ceremony, in simple terms, is an official royal gathering built around tradition, duty, and public roles. But she always tried to keep those moments separate from the deeper pressure of succession. For both parents, that separation mattered, because once duty entered George's private world, it could be almost impossible to push back out. William heard the sentence during a private Windsor ceremony several weeks before the declaration. A senior relative leaned toward George and told him that, when he became older, he would need to listen to the whole family before listening only to his father. The boy looked confused. He did not argue. He simply absorbed the words, and that was enough to make the prince move immediately. William waited until the relative stepped away, then crouched beside George and asked him exactly what had been said. The boy repeated the sentence almost word for word. Catherine saw her husband's expression change before he said anything. He remained calm with his son, but she knew the anger was already building. George had not been given a harmless piece of advice in William's mind. He had been quietly introduced to the idea that his future authority might one day be pulled in different directions. William confronted Catherine later that evening and made his fear clear. The problem was not one sentence, he told her. It was the thinking behind it. Family council, the private guidance relatives may offer around major royal responsibilities, could become dangerous if George started believing everyone had an equal claim on his judgment. Catherine understood why he was alarmed, but she also warned him not to turn a single incident into a permanent family rupture. William began reviewing every informal assumption surrounding George's preparation, access, and future advice. What disturbed him was how many people seemed to believe they would naturally have influence once the boy moved closer to the crown. Charles soon learned that his son was drafting language around undivided succession, meaning a future in which George's authority would not be shaped by rival family expectations. The king warned William privately that words designed to prevent conflict could easily create it instead. William listened. He did not stop. Instead, he requested a private meeting with the relative connected to the Windsor remark. What began as a troubling sentence to a child was about to become an adult confrontation, and this time, the future king had no intention of hiding his anger. William did not summon a committee. He did not send an aide. He asked for one room, one conversation, and no witnesses beyond Catherine waiting nearby. The relative connected to the Windsor remark arrived expecting clarification. Instead, William confronted the deeper issue directly. George was his son. The future crown was not a family bargaining table, and nobody would privately shape the boy's loyalties behind his parents' backs. What followed turned concern into open division. William arranged the meeting only days after the Windsor ceremony because he needed one answer before going any further. Had the remark to George been careless, or had someone genuinely begun thinking about the boy's future as something the wider family could influence? Catherine stayed close but outside the room at first. She believed her husband needed to speak as a father before speaking as Prince of Wales, a title given to the monarch's direct heir, and carrying enormous expectations about the future of the crown. William repeated the sentence exactly as George had remembered it. Listen to the whole family before listening only to his father. Then he asked what it meant. The relative insisted it had been nothing more than advice about unity, loyalty, and staying connected to family. The prince did not raise his voice. He answered more coldly than that. Advice given privately to a child, he said, could become pressure long before the child understood the difference. The relative pushed back and accused William of trying to isolate George from people who cared about him. That accusation struck hard. The future king rejected it immediately, saying protection was not isolation, and that his son would not inherit old family disputes disguised as wisdom. Catherine heard the tension rising from nearby, and when William finally paused, she understood that this had moved far beyond one badly chosen sentence. William then heard the warning he had not expected. If George were publicly treated as uniquely central, the relative argued, other family members could feel pushed aside, and the boy himself might become a target for resentment. Instead of frightening him away from the idea, the warning hardened his position. To William, that reaction proved the danger of ambiguity. If people already feared losing influence, then perhaps influence had become too important. William ended the meeting with one final gesture. He slid an unfinished declaration across the table. The words, "sole successor," were already written into the draft. A declaration, in plain terms, is a formal statement meant to establish an official position clearly and publicly. The relative read the phrase, pushed the paper back, and warned that the consequences would reach far beyond George. William did not remove the words. Catherine saw the draft afterward and realized his intention was now settled. But intention was not power. The next fight would be harder, because William still had to prove that he possessed enough authority to make the monarchy organize itself around what he had decided. Royal power rarely announces itself with raised voices. It moves through wording, precedent, access, timing, and the people willing to stand behind a decision. William had made his emotional position clear. Now came the harder question. Could he make the declaration carry real weight? Charles still wore the crown. George was still a child. Catherine wanted safeguards. Advisors wanted precision. And suddenly, every carefully chosen word became part of a battle between family instinct and royal authority. Charles received the final draft and read it alone before speaking to anyone. He understood immediately that William could not simply erase established succession, the legal order deciding who inherits the throne, with one personal statement. But the declaration could still define how the prince's household, future reign, and immediate family treated George's position. That distinction mattered. Without the king's acceptance, the words might remain a father's demand. With it, they could become something far more powerful inside the monarchy. Charles reached the phrase, "sole successor," removed his glasses, and set the pages down. He said nothing for several moments. The king was not questioning George's place in the future. His fear was more personal. Certainty might protect the boy from rivalry, but it could also place a weight on him years before he was ready to carry it. The monarch had lived long enough with duty to know that clarity could sometimes feel like a cage. William refused to retreat. He told his father that he had grown up surrounded by speculation, family tension, and constant questions about what duty demanded from him. He would not allow George to grow up believing that other people could bargain around his future or quietly shape his loyalties. The prince wanted the path clear, because uncertainty had already begun attracting influence. Charles challenged him directly. Was this truly about protecting George, he asked, or was William trying to prevent his son from inheriting the wounds of his own generation? The future king paused before answering. Then he admitted the two could not be separated. His fear was personal because his experience had taught him what unchecked family pressure could become. Catherine entered the discussion with a condition neither man expected. She would support the declaration, but only if George's childhood remained protected from accelerated ceremonial pressure. Ceremonial pressure, in plain terms, meant being pushed too quickly into formal royal duties simply because his future role had been emphasized. William agreed immediately. She had not weakened his position. She had given it a human limit. Charles finally gave the declaration the recognition William needed. The decision now carried more than private emotion. It had the monarch's acceptance behind it. But that victory came with an immediate cost. As the wording moved through the family, one relative read it not as protection for George, but as a message that everyone else had just been pushed farther away. The declaration had gained power, and the fallout had already begun. Declarations are written in formal language, but their consequences are painfully human. Within hours, relatives who had treated George's future as part of a shared family story were confronting a new reality. William had deliberately narrowed the circle. Some understood, others felt rejected. Catherine worried that a decision intended to protect her son could deepen old wounds. And George himself began noticing something adults had failed to hide. The people around him were suddenly behaving differently. William allowed the wording to move through private palace channels before any public acknowledgement was prepared. Those channels, in simple terms, were the internal routes used to pass sensitive information through the royal household before it reached the outside world. The phrase, "sole successor," immediately created unease, because it sounded more final than many relatives had expected. The prince then made the position even clearer. George's preparation would remain under the direct control of himself and Catherine, and no wider family guidance would be given unless both parents agreed. One close royal relative read the wording twice, then quietly asked an aide to leave the room. Once the door closed, the hurt finally surfaced. Years of family trust, the relative said, now seemed to have been reduced to suspicion. The declaration did not feel like a boundary. It felt like a warning. That reaction reached William soon afterward, and instead of satisfying him, it deepened the discomfort he had been trying to ignore. Catherine confronted him that evening. She understood why he had acted, but she warned that people could genuinely love George and still feel wounded by being pushed away. William agreed with her more than she expected. Yet, he refused to change the principle. Love, he said, did not automatically grant influence. The future king believed affection and authority had become dangerously mixed. and he was determined to separate them before his son became old enough to feel trapped between competing loyalties. George felt the change before anyone explained it. An older relative who had once spoken naturally with him suddenly became formal, careful, almost distant. Later, the boy asked William why everyone had started calling him the future instead of simply talking to him. The question landed harder than any family criticism. The prince had wanted to protect his son from pressure, yet the declaration had already made that pressure impossible to miss. William began to question himself for the first time. Had he removed uncertainty only to make the crown feel closer, heavier, and more frightening? Catherine could see the doubt growing in him, and she did not interrupt it. He needed to face what the decision was doing to George, not just what it prevented others from doing. William finally dismissed advisors for the evening and asked his son to sit with him alone. No declarations, no family strategy, no arguments over succession. The next conversation would not be between a future king and his heir. It would be between a father and a boy who needed to say what everyone else had been too busy deciding for him. For days, adults had spoken about George, what he represented, what he needed, what his future demanded. William finally realized the one voice missing from the entire crisis belonged to the boy at its center. So he removed the documents, dismissed the advisors, and sat with his son privately. No titles, no formal language, no argument about succession. What George said next did not overturn William's declaration, but it completely changed the way his father understood what protecting an heir actually meant. William wanted the conversation to feel different from everything that had come before it. No aides remained nearby, no advisors waited for an answer, and no relative was allowed to shape what George might say. The prince explained that the declaration had been created to stop other people from pulling him in different directions as he grew older. An heir, in simple terms, is the person expected to inherit a position of responsibility after someone else. But William made clear that this future role did not mean his son had to stop being a child in the present. George listened carefully, then answered with a sentence his father was not prepared for. He understood there was a future waiting for him, he said, but he still wanted to be himself before he had to become all of that. William fell quiet. The words were simple, but they exposed the cost of everything that had happened. He had spent days trying to protect George from outside pressure, while creating a new pressure of his own. William admitted that fear had shaped more of the declaration than he wanted to acknowledge. He told George that he had been thinking about old family tensions, competing expectations, and the danger of allowing other people to define his future too early. Then he made one promise that mattered more than any royal wording. His son would never have to earn love by performing duty perfectly. George would not be valued because of the crown waiting ahead of him. George then surprised his father. He did not want the declaration withdrawn. What frightened him was not being named successor. It was the way adults had changed afterward, speaking more carefully, behaving more formally, and treating him as though something inside his childhood had suddenly ended. William finally understood the difference. William reached across the table, closed the folder containing the declaration, and put it aside. The document could define the future crown, he told George, but it would not be allowed to define every part of his present life. The boy relaxed, and for the first time since the crisis began, the decision felt less like a wall closing around him. William had finally found peace with his son. But beyond that private conversation, two words were already moving toward the outside world: sole successor. And once Britain heard them, the declaration would become something neither father nor son could control alone. By morning, the private language of Windsor had become a national obsession. Two words dominated the conversation: sole successor. Commentators debated whether William had protected the crown or placed unbearable pressure on a child. Supporters saw clarity. Critics saw severity. But outside the arguments and headlines, one public moment captured the emotional force of the story better than any expert panel. Ordinary people gathered at a royal gate, staring at the same future from completely different directions. William watched the reactions spread faster than anyone inside the family had expected. Broadcasters explained that he had publicly centered George as the unquestioned future of his own royal line, turning a private family fear into a national argument about succession and childhood. Palace messaging, the carefully chosen wording used to explain royal decisions to the public, stressed continuity, stability, and family unity. It also avoided suggesting that George's everyday life would suddenly become more formal, because that was exactly the fear his parents were now trying to contain. Catherine became increasingly uncomfortable as commentators spoke about her son as though he had already stepped into adult responsibility. She had agreed to the declaration only after William promised that George would not be rushed into heavier ceremonial demands. Now she feared the public language itself could create pressure, even if the palace did not. William reassured her that they would control the pace more carefully from this point forward. He could not control every headline, but he could still protect what happened inside their family. Charles saw the divide almost immediately. Some praised William for ending uncertainty with unusual force. Others argued that the declaration had placed a child beneath a spotlight far too early. The king privately admitted that both reactions contained truth. His son had created clarity, but clarity always came with a cost, when the person carrying it was still growing up. A major morning newspaper turned that tension into one unforgettable front page. A formal image of William beside George appeared beneath the huge headline, "One heir, one future." Copies were held up near the gates of Buckingham Palace as a crowd gathered and began arguing over what the words meant. Some called the decision strong, others called it too severe. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's principal London residence, and a powerful public symbol of the crown, had suddenly become the place where private royal anxiety collided with public judgment. One broadcaster offered the framing that changed the tone of the debate. This was not really about changing who followed William, the presenter argued. It was about how aggressively the prince intended to protect George from the factional pressures that had damaged earlier royal generations. The headlines had delivered their judgment, but William knew the public could never provide the final meaning of his decision. That belonged to the family. And before the crisis could truly end, he still owed them something harder than a declaration. An explanation of what kind of crown he believed George should one day inherit. In the end, the declaration was never truly about moving George closer to a throne. It was about William deciding what would, and would not, be allowed to follow his son toward it. The arguments had exposed fear, loyalty, resentment, and old memories. Catherine had defended childhood. Charles had defended caution. George had defended something simpler, the right to remain himself. And when the family gathered one final time, William gave the words "sole successor" their definitive meaning. William brought Catherine, George, Charles, and the closest affected relatives together for one final private meeting. He was not there to reverse the declaration. He was there to remove the bitterness it had created. The prince explained that sole successor was never meant to say that everyone else mattered less. In this context, succession simply meant the responsibility of carrying the crown forward, and William wanted that responsibility protected from competing family loyalties before those pressures could reach his son. William then turned directly toward the relative connected to the Windsor ceremony. He admitted that his own response had been severe and that anger had shaped some of the language he used afterward. The relative answered with equal honesty, acknowledging that the original comment to George had crossed a boundary even if it had never been intended as a challenge. That admission mattered because the conflict had begun with distrust. Now, for the first time, both sides were accepting responsibility for how far it had gone. Catherine spoke next, and her position remained firm. George's future could be certain, she said, but his childhood would not be sacrificed to satisfy that certainty. Charles quietly agreed. The king understood that duty could prepare someone for a future role, but pressure applied too early could damage the person expected to carry it. William listened to both of them and made clear that this balance would now define the decision. William turned back to George and gave him the reassurance that should have come sooner. Being the sole successor did not mean being alone. His parents, siblings, grandfather, and wider family would still stand beside him. The declaration established responsibility, not emotional isolation. George did not respond with triumph. He responded with relief. The adults had finally stopped treating his future like something to be defended or claimed, and started treating it as something they would help him carry. The conflict ended there. No reversal followed. No second declaration appeared. William had chosen a monarchy built on clear succession, but he had also learned that protecting the crown could never come at the cost of the child expected to inherit it. George remained the future, but he was allowed to remain himself first. There would be no unresolved battle. William had named George his sole successor, but the deeper victory was ensuring that the crown waiting for the boy would never demand that he surrender himself before he was ready to carry it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.